On a summer afternoon in the middle of July 1944, somewhere in the Bocage countryside not far from the town of Saint-Lô in Normandy, a German officer named Friedrich Weber found himself crouched in what remained of a hedgerow, his field glasses pressed against his face. Weber held the rank of Oberstleutnant and commanded a unit within the Panzer Lehr Division, one of the elite armoured formations that Germany had sent to France to throw back the Allied invasion. The hedgerow where he sheltered had been torn apart by days of artillery fire, its ancient roots exposed, its thick branches shattered into splinters. Through the haze of dust and smoke that hung over the Norman fields, Weber watched an American armoured column making its way down a narrow country lane, and what he saw filled him with a creeping sense of dread that he had never quite experienced before in all his years of warfare. The tanks moving toward his position were Shermans, the American M4 medium tank that German engineers and intelligence officers had dismissed with contempt since the first reports had crossed their desks 2 years earlier. Weber had heard all the dismissive talk in the officers' mess, had read the technical assessments that described the Sherman as fundamentally inferior, a machine built by a nation that understood automobiles but not armoured warfare. The engineers who prepared these reports had been quite certain in their conclusions. They assured field commanders that the Americans were bringing toys to a real war, that their industrial methods produced machines that looked impressive on paper but would crumble when faced with proper German engineering and tactical superiority. The Sherman tank, according to these assessments, was nothing more than a mobile coffin, a box mounted on tracks with armour so thin that it might as well be a paperweight well have been made of paper, armed with a gun so inadequate that it posed no real threat to German armour. Weber had believed these reports because they came from men who were supposed to know, men with engineering degrees and technical expertise, men who had designed the panzers that had rolled across Poland and France and driven deep into Russia. But that afternoon, watching through his field glasses as the American column advanced, Weber felt his confidence in those reports beginning to crack and crumble like the hedgerow around him. The Shermans kept coming. His anti-tank guns would fire, and one of the American tanks would brew up, flames and smoke pouring from its hatches, and Weber would allow himself a moment of satisfaction, thinking that yes, the reports were correct, these machines were death traps just as promised. But then, before the smoke had even cleared from the destroyed tank, 3 more Shermans would roll forward to take its place, their guns traversing, searching for the position that had fired. His gunners would knock out another Sherman, and then another, and by the time they had destroyed a dozen of the American tanks, 100 more seemed to appear on the horizon as dusk began to settle over the battlefield. It was not the quality of the individual American tank that terrified Friedrich Weber that evening, though he would later struggle to put this feeling into words when he wrote to his wife. It was the sheer, overwhelming, relentless quantity of them, a flood of steel that seemed to have no end, no limit, no bottom to the well from which they poured. When the factories in America first began producing the M4 Sherman in 1942, the response from German military intelligence was not concern, but amusement bordering on contempt. Officers who examined the technical specifications and compared them to the capabilities of German armour found the Sherman laughably inadequate. Set against the Panzer IV, which had been refined and upgraded through years of combat experience, or the mighty Tiger with its thick armour and devastating 88mm gun, or the sleek Panther with its sloped armour and powerful long-barrelled cannon, the Sherman looked like something designed by amateurs who had read about tanks in a manual but never actually fought in one. The main gun on the standard Sherman was a 75mm weapon that lacked the velocity and penetrating power to punch through the frontal armour of German heavy tanks. This was not a minor deficiency, but a fundamental flaw that seemed to confirm everything German officers believed about American military incompetence. The armour protection on the early models of the Sherman measured only about 50mm at its thickest points, a thickness that left it vulnerable to nearly every anti-tank weapon in the German arsenal, from the purpose-built guns down to the shaped charge Panzerfausts that even ordinary infantry could carry and employ with devastating effect. The mockery that German soldiers directed at the Sherman became part of the dark humour of the war. British tank crews, who received thousands of Shermans through Lend-Lease and fought in them across North Africa and Italy, gave the tank the grim nickname of the Tommy Cooker, a reference to how quickly the tanks would burst into flames when penetrated by German fire. The name caught on among German soldiers, who also called it the Ronson, after the American cigarette lighter company whose advertising slogan promised that their lighters lit on the first strike every time. For German engineers and officers who had grown up in a military culture that prized technical excellence and superior firepower, who believed that every weapon should represent the pinnacle of what was technologically possible, the Sherman seemed almost deliberately inferior, a confirmation of their prejudices about American pragmatism and mass production. It was amateurish, they said. It was adequate at best, laughable at worst. It was what happened when a nation of car manufacturers tried to build weapons of war without understanding the art and science of armoured combat. What those German engineers and intelligence officers failed to understand, what they could not see because their entire worldview was built around the concept of quality over quantity and technical superiority as the path to victory, was that the Americans had not designed the Sherman to win individual tank duels. They had not set out to create a machine that could go toe-to-toe with a tiger and emerge victorious in a fair fight. The Sherman was designed to win something far more important than duels. It was designed to win the war itself, and the path to that victory lay not in perfection, but in production, not in the superiority of individual machines, but in the overwhelming mass of them. The numbers that would eventually emerge from American factories tell a story that no amount of technical superiority could overcome. Between 1942, when production began in earnest, and 1945, when the war in Europe ended, American industry manufactured close to 50,000 Sherman tanks. 50,000. To put that figure in perspective, it represents more tanks than Germany produced of all types combined during the entire war. While German factories struggled to meet production quotas, hampered by Allied bombing, shortages of raw materials, and the increasing complexity of their own designs, American plants turned out Shermans with the same industrial efficiency that had revolutionized automobile manufacturing decades earlier. The Ford Motor Company's massive Highland Park facility, the Chrysler Corporation's purpose-built Detroit Arsenal tank plant, and scores of other factories across the American Midwest became Sherman production centers, their assembly lines running around the clock, 3 shifts a day, 7 days a week. The production rate reached a pace that seems almost impossible to believe. At peak efficiency, these plants were completing 1 Sherman tank every 30 minutes. Every half hour, another complete tank rolled off the assembly line, was driven out of the factory under its own power, underwent brief testing, and was prepared for shipment overseas. The contrast with German tank production could not have been more stark or more telling. The Panther tank, which German engineers had designed to be the answer to the Soviet T-34 and which incorporated sloped armor, a powerful gun, and reasonable mobility, required approximately 150,000 man-hours of labor to construct a single example. The Tiger, that massive beast with its thick armor and feared 88mm gun, demanded even more time, more skilled labor, more precision manufacturing. These were not machines that could be mass-produced. They were almost hand-built, assembled by skilled workers who fitted parts together with the care of craftsmen, making adjustments and modifications as they went. German production methods, rooted in a tradition of skilled trades and artisanal quality, could not match the pace of American assembly lines, where workers performed the same simple task hundreds of times a day, where parts were manufactured to such precise tolerances that they were completely interchangeable, where the goal was not perfection in each individual tank, but acceptable quality in enormous numbers. German officers who captured American supply depots and maintenance facilities in France during the chaotic fighting after D-Day found themselves confronted with a sight that shook their understanding of how warfare was supposed to work. They discovered warehouses filled with Sherman tanks that had been shipped across the Atlantic Ocean in pieces, packed in crates like so many automobile parts, transported on cargo ships by the dozens, and then reassembled at ports along the French coast with the speed and efficiency of an automobile factory. These tanks were not lovingly constructed over weeks and months by master craftsmen. They were bolted together in hours by mechanics following standardized procedures, driven off to be fueled and armed, and sent straight into combat, sometimes within days of arriving on the European continent. The entire system operated with a level of logistical sophistication that German industry, for all its vaunted engineering excellence, could not match. One aspect of the Sherman's design that has received less attention in the popular histories of the war, but which proved absolutely crucial to its effectiveness, was the extraordinary degree of logistical foresight that American engineers built into the vehicle from the beginning. The Sherman was designed not just to fight, but to be supported, maintained, and repaired in the field with minimal specialized equipment or expertise. The engine, depending on the specific model and production run, might be a Ford GAA V8 gasoline engine, or a General Motors 6046 twin diesel, or even the remarkable Chrysler A57 multibank, which consisted of 5 automobile engines mounted together and connected to a common drive shaft. What all these engines had in common was that they could run on standard gasoline or diesel fuel that was readily available throughout the American supply system. There were no special fuel requirements, no exotic lubricants, no temperamental systems that needed constant adjustment by highly trained mechanics. Spare parts were manufactured in enormous quantities and were designed to be interchangeable not just between Shermans of the same model, but often between different models entirely. Tracks, road wheels, transmissions, and countless other components were standardized to the greatest extent possible, which meant that a Sherman crew whose tank had been disabled in the fighting around Normandy could strip parts from a knocked-out hull they found abandoned in a field, install those parts in their own vehicle, and have their tank running again in a matter of hours rather than days or weeks. German tank crews, by contrast, found themselves trapped in a logistical nightmare that grew worse as the war progressed and Germany's strategic situation deteriorated. The Panther, for all its technological sophistication and combat effectiveness, was a maintenance disaster waiting to happen. Its transmission, a complex piece of machinery that had to handle the enormous weight and power of the vehicle, was prone to failure even under normal operating conditions, and in the stress of combat it broke with disturbing regularity. The engines on Panthers and Tigers ran hot, and in the summer heat of France or the winter cold of Russia, they overheated or froze, leaving tanks immobilized not by enemy action, but by their own mechanical fragility. Spare parts were scarce because production could not keep pace with demand, and because the factories that manufactured these parts were increasingly being reduced to rubble by Allied strategic bombing. One German maintenance report from late 1944, written with the dry bureaucratic language that military documents employ even when describing disasters, admitted with striking frankness that German armoured units were losing more tanks to mechanical failure and the inability to repair them than to actual combat with enemy forces. The Panthers and Tigers that broke down behind the lines, that threw tracks or burned out transmissions or cracked engine blocks, were often simply abandoned where they sat because there were no parts available to fix them and no way to transport such massive vehicles to rear-area workshops. The Sherman, which German propaganda had mocked as a coffin on tracks, proved in practice to be an incredibly reliable workhorse that kept running under conditions that would have immobilized more sophisticated vehicles. It was not glamorous. It was not impressive to look at or exciting to discuss in technical terms. But it worked day after day, month after month, and when it broke, it could be fixed quickly and put back into action, which in the brutal arithmetic of armoured warfare mattered far more than technical specifications or theoretical performance characteristics. The limitations of the Sherman in actual combat were undeniable and real, and American tank crews paid for those limitations with their lives throughout the war. At Kasserine Pass in Tunisia in February 1943, during the first major encounter between American and German ground forces, Sherman tanks found themselves outgunned by the long-barreled 75mm cannons that the Germans had mounted on their upgunned Panzer IV models. The American tanks, commanded by crews who were still learning the brutal lessons of armoured warfare, were knocked out at ranges where their own guns could not effectively reply, and the battle became a humiliating defeat that sent shockwaves through the American command structure. In Normandy, after the D-Day landings, Shermans fell victim to the carefully positioned Panthers and Tigers that German commanders had deployed in the Bocage country, where the narrow lanes and thick hedgerows gave every advantage to the defender. A Tiger tank concealed in a tree line could destroy 3 or 4 Shermans before they even located the source of the fire, and the crews of those burning American tanks died knowing that their weapons had been inadequate to the task. But the Americans learned from these defeats, and they adapted their tactics with a speed and flexibility that German commanders found frustrating and eventually demoralizing. American doctrine evolved to emphasize that Shermans would not fight as individuals seeking glorious single combat with enemy tanks. They would operate in coordinated units, typically 5 tanks working together, and they would be supported by the full weight of American artillery, and, crucially, by the overwhelming air superiority that the Allied air forces had established over Europe. American commanders understood that a Sherman might lose a one-on-one duel with a Panther, but 5 Shermans attacking from multiple directions, while artillery rained down on the German positions and fighter bombers screamed overhead looking for targets, were a different proposition entirely. They did not seek out tank duels. They worked to overwhelm the enemy through coordination, numbers, and the integration of all available firepower. The brutal calculus of this approach meant that yes, a Tiger might kill 3 Shermans in a single engagement, might brew up those tanks and send their crews to burn or bail out, but while that Tiger was occupied with those 3 targets, more Shermans would be manoeuvring around its flanks, and the Tiger would be burning through its limited ammunition supply, and sooner or later that Tiger would find itself with an empty magazine or a damaged track or a Sherman round hitting it from the side where the armour was thinner. German engineers had designed and built machines that approached perfection by the standards of armoured warfare. America had built inevitability, had created a system that ensured more tanks would always be available, that losses could always be replaced, that the tide of armour would never stop flowing forward, no matter how many individual vehicles were destroyed. There was another aspect of the Sherman's combat effectiveness that has often been overlooked in discussions that focus narrowly on tank versus tank combat, and that was the versatility of its main armament for missions other than killing enemy armour. The 75mm gun that equipped the standard Sherman, while admittedly weak when it came to penetrating the thick armour of Panthers and Tigers, was absolutely superb for infantry support missions. It fired high-explosive rounds that were more effective, more reliable, and more devastating than the comparable rounds fired by the German 75mm L-70 gun. In the close, brutal fighting in the Bocage country of Normandy, where the real enemies were not enemy tanks but machine gun nests concealed in hedgerows, fortified farmhouses that had been turned into strongpoints, and anti-tank guns hidden in tree lines, the Sherman's ability to deliver accurate, powerful, high-explosive fire proved invaluable. American infantry learned to love the Shermans that supported their advances, because those tanks could reduce a German bunker to rubble with a few well-placed rounds, could blow apart a stone wall that was sheltering enemy troops, could suppress enemy positions while the infantry manoeuvred. American commanders came to value this versatility highly. A Sherman was not just an anti-tank weapon with limited capabilities. It was a multi-purpose combat vehicle that could kill a bunker, support infantry as they advanced across open ground, provide mobile firepower that could be brought to bear wherever it was needed, and yes, in sufficient numbers and with proper tactics, even overwhelm enemy armour. German infantry, who had been told repeatedly by their own officers and propaganda that the Sherman was a useless, inferior machine that posed no real threat, learned through painful experience that when those 75mm high-explosive shells started landing on their positions, stone walls and wooden buildings offered no protection whatsoever. The shells tore through defensive positions like tissue paper, and the infantry who survived these bombardments developed a healthy respect for the American tanks that their superiors had dismissed as beneath serious consideration. As the war progressed and American industry continued to refine and improve the Sherman based on combat experience and feedback from the field, new variants began to appear that addressed some of the tank's most glaring deficiencies. In 1944, the M4A3E8 model rolled off the production lines, and tankers who received this version gave it the affectionate nickname Easy 8. This improved Sherman mounted a 76mm high-velocity gun that, while still not capable of reliably penetrating a Panther's frontal armor, could kill a Panther from the side or rear at reasonable combat ranges. The Easy 8 also featured improved suspension that gave it better mobility and a smoother ride, making it easier for the gunner to acquire and engage targets. Against the heavier German tanks, the Easy 8 still had to be cautious and rely on superior numbers and tactics, but it was a vastly more capable fighting vehicle than the original 75mm Shermans. In the Pacific Theater, where American forces faced a completely different set of challenges in island-hopping campaigns against Japanese defenders who had fortified every cave and bunker, Shermans were modified to carry flamethrowers in place of their main guns. These flame-throwing Shermans could reduce Japanese positions to ash, pouring streams of burning fuel into cave entrances and bunkers in a way that no other weapon could match. The psychological and physical effects of these attacks were devastating, and the flame-throwing Sherman became one of the most feared weapons in the Pacific Campaign. The British Army, which received enormous numbers of Shermans through the Lend-Lease program and depended on them for the bulk of its armoured strength after 1942, took matters into their own hands when it came to improving the tank's ability to fight German armour. British tankers and engineers developed the Sherman Firefly, a modification that involved removing the standard 75mm gun and installing in its place the legendary British 17-pounder anti-tank gun. This weapon, with its high velocity and excellent armour penetration, transformed the Sherman from a tank that could not reliably engage German heavy armour into one that could kill Tigers and Panthers at long range with a fair expectation of success. The Firefly was not without its problems. The 17-pounder was a large weapon that barely fit in the Sherman's turret, and its recoil was punishing, but the results spoke for themselves. In Normandy, during the brutal fighting in the villages and hedgerows after D-Day, Fireflies destroyed Tigers and Panthers with a regularity that shocked German tank crews who had grown accustomed to feeling invincible behind their thick armour. At the town of Villers-Bocage, in an engagement that would become legendary in British military history, a single Firefly commanded by a skilled gunner managed to knock out 3 Tiger tanks in a matter of minutes, catching them by surprise and punching through their armour before they could react. German engineers, who had spent years mocking the Sherman as an inferior American design, found themselves confronted with the uncomfortable reality that this same basic tank, when armed with a proper gun, could carry and effectively employ a weapon that was superior to anything mounted on their own designs. The cognitive dissonance this created was profound. Beyond the technical specifications and combat statistics, there was a psychological dimension to the Sherman's impact on the war that was perhaps even more significant than its battlefield performance. German tank crews were the elite of the Wehrmacht. They had trained in specialized schools, had learned their craft from veterans who had fought in Poland and France and Russia, and they took enormous pride in their machines and their skills. They expected to be superior to their opponents. This was not arrogance, or at least not merely arrogance. It was a fundamental assumption built into German military culture and doctrine. German tanks were supposed to be better. German tactics were supposed to be more sophisticated. German crews were supposed to win their engagements because they were simply better at armoured warfare than anyone else. But in Normandy, and then across France, and then in the desperate fighting in Germany itself, these elite crews found themselves facing wave after wave of American Shermans, and behind those Shermans were American artillery batteries ready to deluge any position with high explosive shells, and above those Shermans were American fighter bombers that would swoop down on anything that moved, and supporting those Shermans were American infantry units that seemed to have unlimited ammunition and supplies. Even if a Tiger crew managed to destroy 10 Shermans in a single engagement, fought with all the skill and courage they possessed, the 11th Sherman might be the one that got them, might catch them while they were reloading or maneuvering or focused on another target. The mathematics were simple and brutal. No matter how superior an individual German tank might be, no matter how skilled its crew, the sheer weight of numbers made defeat inevitable. One German officer, interviewed after the war and speaking with the candor that defeat and captivity can bring, admitted that it was not the American tanks themselves that German soldiers feared most. The tanks were dangerous, certainly, but the real fear came from the numbers, from the knowledge that the more Shermans you destroyed, the more would appear to take their place. There seemed to be no end to them, no bottom to the American reserves, no limit to how many tanks the factories across the Atlantic could produce and ship to Europe. The psychological weight of fighting an enemy with apparently infinite resources, where every tactical victory was meaningless because strategic defeat was inevitable, wore down even the most dedicated soldiers. The logistics behind this avalanche of armour were as impressive as the production numbers themselves, though logistics rarely receives the attention it deserves in popular histories of warfare. Each American armoured division deployed to Europe fielded hundreds of Sherman tanks, and supporting those hundreds of tanks were thousands of supply trucks carrying spare parts, ammunition of all types, fuel in enormous quantities, food for the crews, and everything else required to keep an armoured division functioning in combat. The American supply system operated with an efficiency that German officers found almost incomprehensible. Repair units worked with assembly line precision, treating disabled tanks not as unique machines requiring individual attention, but as standardized products that could be fixed using standardized procedures and interchangeable parts. A Sherman that had been knocked out but not completely destroyed, that had been hit in a way that killed or wounded the crew but left the basic vehicle salvageable, would often be recovered from the battlefield within hours of the engagement ending, towed back to a forward repair facility, stripped of damaged components, fitted with replacement parts pulled from the massive stocks that the supply system maintained, and returned to combat-ready status within days. The speed of this cycle was remarkable. German tank losses, by contrast, tended to be permanent. Once a Panther or Tiger was knocked out, even if the damage was repairable in theory, the lack of spare parts, the shortage of skilled mechanics, the vulnerability of repair facilities to Allied air attack, and the general breakdown of German logistics meant that the tank was usually lost for good. Factories in Germany were being systematically destroyed by British and American strategic bombing, and even those factories that remained operational could not produce replacement vehicles at a rate that came close to matching losses. By late 1944, as the war entered its final phase and Germany's situation became increasingly desperate, American tank production was outpacing German production by nearly 10-1. For every tank that rolled out of a German factory, 10 Shermans were being completed in American plants. This disparity meant that even if German tanks achieved kill ratios of 3 or 4-1 in their favour, even if German crews fought with skill and determination, the simple arithmetic of replacement rates made German defeat inevitable. There was no coming back from this kind of production disadvantage, no tactical brilliance that could overcome such a fundamental disparity in resources. One statistic from the Battle of the Bulge, Germany's last major offensive in the West, illustrates this disparity with stark clarity. During that desperate winter offensive in December 1944, when German forces launched a surprise attack through the Ardennes forest in an attempt to split the Allied armies and capture the vital port of Antwerp, the Americans deployed nearly 4,000 Sherman tanks to contain and then destroy the German offensive. 4,000 tanks in a single battle. The Germans, scraping together every Panther and Tiger they could find, every tank they could pull from other sectors and throw into this last gamble, fielded fewer than 500 heavy tanks. 500 against 4,000. The Germans did inflict heavy losses on the American armour. German tank crews and anti-tank teams fought with skill and sometimes desperation, and hundreds of Shermans were knocked out during the fighting. But the weight of numbers, the sheer overwhelming mass of American armour, told the story. When fuel shortages began to cripple the German advance, when the tanks that had driven deep into the American lines found themselves immobilized not by enemy fire but by empty fuel tanks because the supply columns that were supposed to bring them gasoline had been destroyed by Allied fighter bombers, the Shermans counterattacked with relentless pressure. They pushed forward day and night, giving the Germans no time to rest or regroup, grinding down the offensive through sheer persistence. By January 1945, when the Battle of the Bulge finally ended in complete German defeat, the snow-covered fields and forests of the Ardennes were littered with the burned-out hulks of destroyed tanks. Most of those wrecks were Shermans, testimony to the price that American tank crews had paid, but scattered among them were also Panthers and Tigers that had been abandoned by their crews when the fuel ran out, left behind as Germany retreated because there was no way to recover them and no fuel to move them, even if recovery had been possible. The Germans had built masterpieces of engineering, machines that represented the peak of what their technology and industrial skill could achieve, and those masterpieces now sat abandoned in the snow because the system that created them could not sustain them in combat. The Americans had built what German engineers dismissively called coffins, simple boxes on tracks that lacked sophistication and elegance, and those coffins kept rolling forward because the system behind them was designed for sustainability and mass production rather than individual perfection. German engineers were not completely blind to the truth of what was happening, though acknowledging it meant confronting some uncomfortable realities about their own assumptions and methods. Reports sent back to Berlin from the front, written by officers who had to explain why Germany was losing the armoured war despite the technical superiority of its tanks, warned that American production capacity was overwhelming German industry. One engineer, in a report that was probably more candid than was wise in Nazi Germany, confessed that the fundamental problem was one of philosophy and approach. "We build works of art," he wrote. "They build tools. In war, tools win." This was a devastating admission from a culture that prized engineering excellence and technical sophistication above almost everything else, an acknowledgement that the American approach of good enough quality in overwhelming quantity was proving more effective than the German pursuit of perfection in limited numbers. Yet Nazi ideology and leadership locked into patterns of thinking that emphasized German superiority and refused to accept that the enemy might have fundamental advantages that could not be overcome through willpower or technical excellence, could not or would not adjust to this reality. Hitler himself continued to demand ever heavier, ever more powerful tanks, insisting on the development of monsters like the Tiger II, which weighed 70 tons and was so heavy that it broke the bridges it tried to cross, consumed fuel at such a rate that keeping it supplied was nearly impossible, and was so complex to manufacture that only a handful could be produced even under ideal conditions. Meanwhile, American commanders, who understood through hard experience the value of mobility, reliability, and maintainability in actual combat conditions rather than theoretical performance, kept ordering more Shermans by the tens of thousands, kept refining the production process to make it even more efficient, kept the assembly lines running day and night. The shock that ordinary German soldiers experienced when they encountered the reality of American armoured strength was deeply personal and psychological. Prisoners captured in Normandy, interrogated by American intelligence officers who were trying to understand German morale and perceptions, expressed genuine disbelief at the number of Shermans they had faced. One prisoner, a young soldier who had been told by his officers that the Americans had only a few dozen tanks in all of France, told his interrogator with a kind of stunned bewilderment that he had thought the American army possessed perhaps 50 tanks in total. "You have 5,000, he said, still trying to process what he had experienced. The numbers were incomprehensible to soldiers who had been raised on propaganda about German superiority and American weakness. Another prisoner, a veteran Panther crewman who had fought on the Eastern Front before being transferred to France, admitted with the exhausted honesty of a man who had seen his world collapse that yes, his tank had been superior to any individual Sherman it faced. "Our tank was better," he said. "But what use is superiority when they surround you? When there are 5 of them for every one of us? When you kill 3 and 2 more come from behind?" This was the nightmare that German tankers lived, the knowledge that tactical skill and technical superiority meant nothing against an enemy that could absorb any losses and keep coming. Even on the Eastern Front, where Germany faced the massive armies of the Soviet Union and where the war had degenerated into a brutal struggle of attrition on a scale that dwarfed the fighting in the West, reports filtered back to German headquarters about American Lend-Lease Shermans fighting in Soviet service. The United States had sent nearly 4,000 Shermans to the USSR as part of the massive aid program that kept the Soviet war machine supplied with everything from tanks to trucks to food. Soviet tank crews, accustomed to the crude but effective T-34 with its cramped interior and minimal crew comforts, praised the Shermans for features that German tanks often lacked. The radios in the Shermans actually worked reliably, allowing tanks to communicate with each other and coordinate their actions in ways that Soviet and often German tanks could not. The mechanical reliability meant that Shermans kept running when T-34s and German tanks broke down. German officers, hearing from prisoners and intelligence reports that their enemies on two fronts, both in the West against the Americans and British and in the East against the Soviets, were driving the same American-built machine, could only shake their heads at the implications. The Sherman was everywhere, on every front, in every theatre, seemingly infinite in number. By 1945, as the war entered its final months and Allied armies closed in on Germany from all directions, the verdict on the tank war was absolutely clear to anyone willing to see it honestly. Germany had not lost because its tanks were inferior. The Panther and Tiger remained formidable weapons right up until the end. Germany had lost because its industry, its logistics, its entire system of production and supply could not match the flood of material that poured out of American factories. When American armour finally rolled across the Rhine River into Germany proper, when Shermans climbed through the Alps and drove through the streets of German cities, they came not in dozens or even hundreds, but in thousands upon thousands, an endless parade of tanks that seemed to have no limit. For the German engineers who had laughed at the Sherman back in 1942, who had dismissed it as a primitive machine unworthy of serious consideration, who had written confident assessments about American industrial incompetence, the joke had turned bitter and cruel. They had built marvels of engineering, machines that any tank designer would be proud to have created, and those marvels had not been enough to change the outcome of the war. All their expertise, all their technical sophistication, all their commitment to quality and excellence had been overwhelmed by an enemy who understood that war was not about building the best individual weapon, but about building enough weapons to ensure victory. In the years after the war, when historians and military analysts began conducting interviews and compiling the official histories, many German officers admitted their fundamental miscalculation about American armour and the industrial might behind it. Heinz Guderian, the general who had pioneered German panzer tactics and who was considered the father of Germany's armoured forces, offered a quote that would be repeated for decades afterward. "Quantity," he remarked with the bitter wisdom of hindsight, "has a quality all its own." We learned this lesson too late. It was an acknowledgement that the German emphasis on technical superiority and individual excellence had been fundamentally misguided when faced with an enemy that could produce 10 tanks for every one Germany built. Albert Speer, who had served as Minister of Armaments and War Production for Nazi Germany and who had struggled throughout the war to keep German industry functioning in the face of Allied bombing and resource shortages, testified at the Nuremberg trials after the war about Germany's inability to match American production. When asked about the tank war, Speer admitted with characteristic bluntness that Germany had simply had no answer to America's industrial scale and capacity. "The Sherman was not the best tank of the war," he said, choosing his words carefully. "But it was the most produced tank, and that is what mattered in the end." Coming from the man who had been responsible for German war production, this was a damning assessment of Germany's entire approach to armoured warfare. The Sherman, which had been mocked as a death trap, which had been dismissed as a coffin on tracks, which German engineers had confidently predicted would fail in combat against proper German armour, became instead a symbol of something far more important than individual technical excellence. It became a symbol of inevitability, of the overwhelming power of industrial production, of an approach to warfare that understood victory came not from building perfect weapons, but from building enough adequate weapons to overwhelm the enemy. The Sherman fought on every front of World War II, in every theatre of operations, in the service of nearly every Allied army. It was there in North Africa and Italy, in France and Germany, in the Pacific Islands and in Burma, in Soviet service on the Eastern Front and in British service at El Alamein. Long after 1945, Shermans continued to serve in the armies of dozens of countries around the world, fighting in wars in Korea and the Middle East and elsewhere, a testament to the basic soundness of its design and the ease with which it could be maintained and operated. To the men who designed and built the Sherman, the engineers and production managers and factory workers in Detroit and elsewhere, it had never been about creating art or pushing the boundaries of what was technically possible. Their goal had been utility, reliability, and above all, quantity. They had succeeded beyond even their own expectations. To the German soldiers who faced the Sherman in combat, who watched them keep coming no matter how many were destroyed, the tank became a nightmare of endless repetition, a machine that embodied everything terrifying about fighting an enemy with superior resources. Kill one Sherman and another appeared to take its place. Burn 10 and 100 came forward to replace them. Destroy 100 and 1,000 more were already being shipped across the Atlantic. In the final reckoning, when all the after-action reports had been filed and all the statistics had been compiled and all the lessons had been learned, German engineers who had laughed at the Sherman in 1942 were forced to confront the harshest truth that warfare teaches. Perfection, they learned, means very little when your enemy has more of everything that matters. More tanks rolling off assembly lines, more fuel in storage depots, more factories churning out spare parts, more ships carrying supplies across the ocean, more men trained and ready to crew the tanks, more ammunition stockpiled at forward depots, more of everything that makes an army function. Against that overwhelming tide of material superiority, even the strongest armour eventually cracked, even the most skilled crews eventually fell, even the best-designed tanks eventually burned. And so the Sherman rolled forward through 1944 and into 1945, grinding its way across Europe with relentless, inexorable momentum. It was not the best tank of the Second World War by any objective measure of individual capability. The German Panther was probably superior as a pure fighting machine. The Soviet T-34 arguably had a better balance of armour, firepower and mobility. But the Sherman was the tank that won the war, not through technical excellence, but through the sheer weight of its numbers, and in the end that was the only measure of success that truly mattered. It kept coming, kept rolling forward, kept appearing on battlefields in numbers that the enemy could not match or counter, and that relentless advance, more than any individual tank battle or technical specification, decided the outcome of the armoured war in Europe. The Sherman's legacy was not perfection but persistence, not artistry but adequacy in overwhelming abundance, and that proved to be exactly what victory required.